Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 61. The Sultan in Constantinople. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the aftermath of the death of Mesud, the escalating struggle for power in Anatolia that kept spiraling out of control following Kılıç Arslan II's seizure of the throne. We ended with the escalating crisis boiling over as the Turks attacked the imperial army marching back to Constantinople through Anatolia. And today, we will discuss the consequences of this final breach between Constantinople and Konya. We will see the whole world, from Constantinople to Sivas to Damascus to Ankara, descend on Kılıç Arslan II as the Sultan desperately scrambles to save himself and his young regime. And while we will see the Limping Lion suffer a great humiliation, it turns out that this humiliation will, in its own way, set the stage for the greatest victory of his career. Indeed, one of the greatest victories in all of Turkish history. A victory at a place called Myriokephalon. Now to begin, as Emperor Manuel Komnenos finally returned to Constantinople, he was absolutely furious. From his perspective, the Limping Lion had launched an unprovoked attack even after giving permission to the emperor to march across his territory. Clearly, Manuel had been correct to make a deal with Nureddin. And no doubt, the dreams he had harbored as a younger man during the first years of his reign, of conquering Konya and retaking Anatolia, began coming back. And thus, after over a decade of peace and even alliance, the imperial armies again began assembling in the west to go to war with the Sultanate of Rum. But this would not just be a Roman war in western Anatolia. The war against Kılıç Arslan would instead be a multi-front struggle that would involve cooperation among all three of the main players of this brand new anti-Konya alliance. The Emperor in the west, the Danishmand Bey Yağbasan in the east, and perhaps mightiest of them all, the great Nureddin Zengi in the south. This multi-fronted war against the Limping Lion began in the west. The imperial campaign to mete out vengeance to the Sultan started in late 1159. That is, the very same year that the emperor made it back to Constantinople. That means that preparing for this campaign was basically the first thing that Manuel did after getting home. The emperor assembled one army in Ipsala, in Thrace. This was a city on the river Meriç, which lay on the Via Egnatia, the great Roman highway that connected Constantinople to the city of Dyrrhachium in what is now Albania. Today, Ipsala is a small town in European Turkey. Incidentally, it lies right next to the main highway border crossing between Greece and Turkey. While this army assembled in Europe, the emperor ordered the Roman governors along the borders of the Sultanate in Anatolia to begin assaults on Turkish garrisons with the goal of tying down the Turkish troops. In early 1160, as winter drew to a close, the emperor then ferried his army over the Dardanelles and began marching to Eskişehir, that is, Dorylaeum. This Roman army then proceeded to basically rampage around the region, what would have been the very northwest of the Sultanate's domains, just over the Turkish side of the porous frontier border zone, and quite honestly, they likely laid waste to settlements within the frontier zone that putatively were imperial subjects. Remember that this area, the frontier between the Sultanate and the Empire, was not a hard line. It was a zone of overlapping authority and influence. John Kinemos tells us that as his army spread out across northwestern Anatolia, the emperor ascended to a great hill, and there ordered that the imperial trumpets be blown. A message to the Turks that the emperor was in command and that the Roman armies had once again returned to the plateau. But the Turks did not take this lying down. As news of the invasion began spreading out, eventually making its way to Kılıç Arslan, the Turkish commanders in the region organized a response. Now, many of the troops were likely tied down opposing the Byzantine armies that the emperor had earlier ordered out. Nevertheless, the local commanders were able to pull together something of an army. Likely, they drew from the local tribes as well as the soldiers of the Sultanate itself, though we just can't be sure. Thus, as the imperial army began marching deeper into Anatolia, they were soon ambushed by a relatively large Turkish army. This army, deploying the classic tactics of the Turks, managed to scout around and find a decent ambush spot where they sprung a trap. Having gotten the drop on the Romans, the Turkish army began inflicting some real damage. We don't have the specifics, but soon enough, the Roman army began folding under the withering Turkish attack. I think we should imagine the classic Turkish style of assault. Bands of mounted archers rushing out from behind the hills and rocks, ensnaring groups of Roman soldiers, and firing off their volleys of arrows before disappearing. But the Roman commanders managed to get word off to the emperor, who was operating nearby. Manuel gathered up his army and rushed off to their aid, and according to John Kinemos, the arrival of the emperor and his imperial army turned the battle. Naturally, Kinemos takes the opportunity to fawningly describe the battlefield heroics of Manuel Komnenos. He also includes an interesting anecdote where Manuel defeats a great Turkish warrior in single-handed combat. Among the Turks, there was one courageous and vigorous individual. When he observed that out of all of those not one opposed the emperor in combat, boiling with rage, he seized a sword from the hands of one of his fellows and rushed to smite him. But grasping him by the hair, the emperor took him captive, along with 3 other nobles. Now, all of this is most certainly exaggerated, but the result is clear enough. The Turkish army was beaten back and retreated, and the imperial army was soon in firm control of the northwest corner of the plateau. With the Turks in retreat, the emperor then began planning for a campaign south, and he would finish up the year by marching towards Alashehir and the Meander Valley. Meanwhile, things were going from bad to worse for Kılıç Arslan II. Because as we discussed, this invasion by the emperor was not the only front in the expanding war that the Sword Lion was facing. The struggle with the emperor was in fact just the western front of what was quickly transforming into an existential multi-front war that would engulf the Sultanate of Rum. And of course, this second front was opened in 1160 in Sivas by the most implacable of Kılıç Arslan's enemies, Yağ Basan, the Danishmand Bey. As I mentioned last time, after the initial war between the two in 1155, and then another brief and little attested to war in 1158, a temporary truce had been signed between Konya and Sivas. The Sultan of Rum held Cappadocia and south-central Anatolia, while Yağ Basan ruled from Sivas, and his ally, the Sultan's half-brother Şahan Shah, ruled Ankara and north-central Anatolia. However, this truce was always going to be temporary, given the growing enmity and hostility between the Sultan and Ya Abasan, and it predictably broke down in 1160 as the Sultan was facing an invasion from the west. There were two main reasons for this. One reason was, of course, the Roman invasion of the Sultanate. I mean, how can Ya Abasan pass that opportunity up? He was already in communication with the emperor, who was no doubt urging him to attack. Indeed, Niketas Choniates tells us explicitly that Manuel had enticed Ya Abasan to join the war, to open up a second front in the east as the emperor had invaded from the west. He writes, Manuel presented Ya Abasan with gifts, making it evident that he supported him in the hostility. He loathed the Sultan as being underhanded, deceitful, duplicitous, and pernicious, not only to his own kinsmen and blood relations, but also to the Roman borderlands, which he continually plundered and devastated. But the second reason had to do with the perpetual flashpoint between the Danishmend Beylik and the Sultanate of Rum, Malatya. Now, if you will recall, Malatya had been essentially conquered by Sultan Masud when he campaigned in the east after defeating the Crusaders. However, the Sultan had not actually taken the city. He had merely accepted the submission of the local Danishmend Bey, Dhul Qarnayn, a son of the prior Danishmend Bey of Malatya, Ain al-Dawla, and had installed Dhul Qarnayn's mother on the throne. Dhul Qarnayn's mother was in fact Masud's niece, and she seems to have ruled the city for a spell, though of course her son eventually returned. Now, after the death of Masud, Dhul Qarnayn had naturally ceased his subservience to Konya, and while he drew closer to his uncle Ya Abasan, he was not really a total vassal of the Danishmend Bey in Sivas. Michael the Syrian passes on to us an interesting detail, that Kılıç Arslan II had married his daughter to Dhul Qarnayn, basically a way to balance Danishmend power in the Beylik, and he further tells us that Ya Abasan had assented to this. This is an indication that the two great powers of Turkish Anatolia basically agreed that Malatya would be a quasi-independent Danishmend Beylik, in some sense subservient to both Konya and Sivas, a place where both sides recognized each other's valid interests and agreed to a balance of power. This situation was tolerable enough to both Sivas and Konya, but ultimately not beloved by either. And of course, it was ultimately unstable. It sort of rested on Dhul Qarnayn being in charge, and his ability to play the two sides off each other and balance their interests. But then in 1160 Dhul Qarnayn died. Ya Abasan acted quickly, and relying on his prestige as the Danishmend Bey, appointed his young nephew Nasreddin Mehmet, a son of Dhul Qarnayn, to be the Bey of Malatya. This was a way to increase the power of the Danishmend Bey in Sivas in the critical city of Malatya, to make it more of a vassal to Sivas. Kılıç Arslan II was, of course, just not going to tolerate any of this. Even with the emperor breathing down his neck in the west, he just had to do something against Ya Abasan in the east. And I think this is a testament to the critical importance of Malatya and its passes at this time. There is a reason that this city has been the flashpoint between the Danishmends and the Sultanate of Rum for generations at this point. And so, Kılıç Arslan gathered up an army and rode east to confront Ya Abasan over the winter of 1160 to 1161. However, this campaign just was not fated to go well. With the Byzantines still campaigning in western Anatolia, there were real limits on the forces Kılıç Arslan could raise. Indeed, as we will get to shortly, a large Turkish army was currently operating in the west under the command of a bey named Süleyman. And while Kılıç Arslan seems to have gotten support from the Danishmend Bey Melik Zünun, it just doesn't seem like the Sword Lion had sufficient numbers with him. In a battle in the southern marches of Anatolia between Kayseri and Malatya, likely somewhere near Elbistan, the combined armies of Kılıç Arslan and Melik Zünun were defeated by Yağ Basan. The Sultan was forced to flee back to Konya. His forces in the east were now seriously diminished, and his reputation had taken a major blow. Malatya, the great city guarding the passes to Syria and the heartland of the Muslim world, was now firmly in Danishmend hands. And then, already shaken by his loss in the east and the great Byzantine invasion in the west, Kılıç Arslan suffered yet another grievous blow. News came to Konya that at the same time that Kılıç Arslan had been riding east to fight Yağ Basan in the battle that he was fated to lose, and at the same time that the emperor was invading in the west, Nureddin Zengi had invaded the Sultanate from the south. Now, the technical excuse for Nureddin's invasion was that Kılıç Arslan, rather stupidly I think, had been hosting a rebellious brother of Nureddin's. This had been a part of the anti-Nureddin alliance that he had made with Toros the Great and the Crusaders in Antioch. Naturally, Nureddin hated this. And remember, he had just built a great anti-Kılıç Arslan alliance with Yağ Basan and the Emperor of the Romans. But of course, I think the real reason for this invasion is that with the other members of this anti-Kılıç Arslan alliance currently in the process of invading the Sultanate, Nureddin decided that he wanted to get in on the action. And so, with the Sultan having been driven from the eastern border region after his defeat at the hands of Yağ Basan, Nureddin launched an assault from Syria on the Anatolian marches. He apparently did this in alliance with the local governor in Maraş, and he quickly took Besni, Kaysun, Raban, and even the great city of Maraş itself. Remember, this was where Kılıç Arslan's career had basically started. These were the lands that Mesut had conquered and organized into a new administrative unit and handed over to him. Now, all that remained to him of his original power base were the marches closest to Kayseri. And who knew what was going to happen there if the war with Yağ Basan and Nureddin continued going on like this? So things are not looking good for the Limping Lion. The eastern front of the Great War seemed to be in total collapse, with both Nureddin and Yağ Basan advancing everywhere. But there were actually some rays of sunshine peeking out through the darkening clouds, at least for now, because perhaps surprisingly, the western theater of the war was actually starting to turn to the Sultan's favor in spring 1161. See, back in 1160 through the winter of 1160-1161, as Kılıç Arslan had been riding east to confront Yağ Basan, the imperial armies had decamped from northwestern Anatolia and moved south. They had reinforced Alaşehir, ancient Philadelphia, before moving towards the Meander Valley, the great valley that served as the best route to the center of Anatolia for millennia. The emperor himself had marched up the great valley to reach Konya before, and in the near future he will march up it again to a place called Myriokephalon. But as the imperial armies had been moving south and reinforcing Alaşehir, the Sultanate's forces pulled themselves together under the leadership of a bey named Suleiman. When the Roman army marched up the Meander Valley, Suleiman assembled the armies in the mountains at its head. Then, Suleiman got something of a lucky break. As the Roman army entered the mountains on the plateau in the winter of early 1161, a massive snowstorm descended on western Anatolia. This was, of course, terrible news for the Roman army marching through the mountain passes. The army basically got snowed in, with various contingents cut off from each other, all while being extremely cold and wet and miserable. Naturally, this situation provided the Turks with an opportunity to strike. Indeed, John Kinemos himself said that this was the perfect chance for a Turkish assault. But knowing full well the dire straits that the Sultanate was now in, Suleiman Bey instead tried to negotiate from a position of strength. Indeed, Suleiman had tried this earlier. As the emperor was marching south sometime in 1160, Suleiman had sent him an embassy. But the emperor was just not interested at the time. Indeed, John Kinemos writes, when he recognized that they had nothing valid to declare, he dismissed them, threatening that unless they acted in accordance with his will, the Romans' cavalry would shortly overrun their land and pillage everything even worse than now. Now, with the Roman army stuck in the snowy passes, Suleiman tried to negotiate a second time. In a sign of the messy nature of the Turkish-Roman frontier world, the leader of this embassy was likely a Turkish bey whose name was rendered in Greek as Poupakes, a relative of Suleiman, who had previously served in the Byzantine armies. Reportedly, Poupakes recognized the emperor from his time serving Constantinople and attempted to approach him in an appropriately respectful and servile manner. But surprisingly, the emperor was again having none of it. Yet again, the Turkish embassy was dismissed, and the imperial armies began slogging forward through the snow. But of course, the consequences of this decision of the stubborn Manuel Komnenos were foreseeable. Given the snowy conditions and the state of the Byzantine army, the Turks were able to put up a stiff resistance as the Romans advanced through the passes. Striking from the snowy mountains, Suleiman's army inflicted substantial losses on the marching imperial armies trudging through the passes. And then Suleiman scored a couple even bigger wins. As the emperor became bogged down in the late winter advance, Suleiman launched attacks on Laodicea near modern-day Denizli. We last saw this city as the home of the Roman governor who had betrayed the Crusaders to Mesud. Now, John Kinemos says that the Turks severely damaged it, carrying off at sword point many of its inhabitants, from youth upwards, whom they made captive, a great and innumerable multitude. Suleiman was also able to take a city that John Kinemos calls Fileta, which he calls an eastern city. We don't know where that is, but presumably it was somewhere in the interior of western Anatolia. The Roman army in the west, the army that had started this whole war, was now incapable of advancing further, as Suleiman Bey began racking up victories in western Anatolia. So all in all, things seem to be going pretty good, right? A welcome reprieve from the disasters in the eastern and southern theaters. Well, not so fast, because Emperor Manuel Komnenos made the exact same calculation. He needed more reinforcements if he was going to avenge himself and defeat the Limping Lion. And thus, the emperor sent off his nephew, John Kontostephanos, to Cilicia and the Levant to gather reinforcements that had been promised to the emperor when he marched into the region in triumph in 1159. These new vassals included Kılıç Arslan's erstwhile allies, Toros the Great and Reynold the Prince of Antioch. Soon, John would be able to march up through Cilicia towards Konya itself. The southern theater, previously contained to the mountainous marches around Maraş, would now be extended to the Taurus Mountains north of Cilicia and just to the south of Konya itself, the very underbelly of the Sultanate of Rum. And Manuel did something else. In the words of John Kinemos, he wrote to the Sultan's brother Şahan Shah, who then governed Gangra, that is Çankırı, and Ankara, and to his son-in-law Ya Basan, who ruled both Kayseri and Amasya and other outstanding cities, which are situated in the Cappadocians' land. The emperor was proposing a coordinated assault from all sides against the embattled Sword Lion. Now, the emperor was already in an alliance with Nureddin and Ya'abasan, but it seems that this may have been the first time that actual coordination was discussed by the allies in both the eastern and western theaters of the war. And furthermore, it appears that it was only now that Shahanshah was firmly brought into the alliance. If Shahanshah entered the war against Konya, there would also be a new northern front, with armies riding south into Konya from Ankara. The potential opening of new northern and southern fronts began convincing Kılıç Arslan that he should find a way to end the war. The whole world, from east, west, north, and south, was seemingly against him. He had lost badly in the east and the south against Ya'abasan and Nureddin. And though the struggle in the west against the emperor was going pretty well, strategically, he could not afford to continue fighting the emperor for much longer. And then, any hope that Kılıç Arslan II might have had to continue the war ended when he learned that Ya'abasan was fomenting a plot to overthrow him and replace him with Shahanshah. No doubt, hoping to pull a repeat of the trick played by Emir Ghazi with Sultan Masoud and get a puppet Sultan of Rum in his pocket. As Michael the Syrian writes, "Now in this period, Kılıç Arslan learned from slanderers that Ya'abasan, united with many emirs, planned to depose him from his throne, kill him, and install his brother in his stead." This plot certainly had the backing of Nureddin, the ally of both Ya'abasan and Shahanshah. No doubt, the Sultan acted quickly to snuff out the supporters of this plot in Konya, but he was surely shaken. The war was going extremely badly, and clearly his hold on power was beginning to slip. If things kept going on like this, and if the Sultanate's enemies came barreling towards Konya from all four sides, then the plot to replace him with Shahanshah could very well succeed. And so Kılıç Arslan II bowed to the inevitable. The war was effectively lost. The dangers and costs of continuing the struggle were just too high. There was no possible way for anything approaching a victory to be achieved now. It was over. But the Limping Lion now displayed what would turn out to be a really great strength of his. A sort of amazing ability to negotiate from a position of weakness. See, the second Sword Lion still had a choice in how to end the war. He could effectively choose who to surrender to and in what order, and in how to surrender. On the one hand, there were his eastern enemies, led and backed by Nureddin. And these enemies were far more dangerous and far more implacable than the emperor in the west. It wasn't the emperor who was plotting to have him killed and replaced with Shahanshah. It wasn't the emperor who had been conniving in Sivas against his family for like his whole life. It wasn't the emperor who saw him as a rival for the spot of top leader in the Muslim world. And actually, all things considered, the emperor was really the best person to come to terms with. The empire and the Sultanate of Rum had been allies for over a decade before this recent war. And cutting a deal with the emperor would mean stabilization of the Western Front, allowing Kılıç Arslan to concentrate forces against his more implacable enemies in the east. Furthermore, as everyone knew, submitting to Byzantium often involved payments from Constantinople. No doubt, a welcome supplement to what was by now surely a cash-strapped treasury. Now, of course, making a peace with Nureddin and by extension Ya'abasan in Sivas was still going to have to happen, but it would be a bitter, bitter pill to swallow, and it would be best to make that unfortunate deal from as strong a position as possible. Therefore, Kılıç Arslan calculated that the best thing to do was surrender to the emperor first and end the war in the west. This would leave him in a stronger position to come to some sort of truce with his enemies in the east and the south and forestall Shahanshah's entrance into the war. The first embassy sent by the Limping Lion to Emperor Manuel doesn't seem to have gone particularly well. Perhaps because his army in the west was actually winning, Kılıç Arslan appears to have started the negotiations by lowballing the emperor. He promised merely the return of any Roman citizens taken in Turkish raids in return for a formal imperial pardon and peace. The emperor naturally refused this, but the negotiations nevertheless began. But then something happened that basically forced the Sultan to capitulate immediately. In the south, the Byzantine commander John Konstantinos began moving his army up from the Levant and Cilicia to march against the Sultanate. However, this expeditionary force does not seem to have been particularly large. Hoping to defeat them and thus extract a better deal from the emperor, Kılıç Arslan sent an army against this force. According to John Kinemos, this was a large army numbering over 20,000 men, though of course we can't really trust that. But the ensuing battle against Konstantinos was a disaster. As occasionally happened, the Roman army seems to have actually caught up to the Turks in a charge, actually gotten in close enough to force the Turks into hand-to-hand combat. Remember, the Turks excelled as mounted horse archers who could strike from afar and then ride away. When they were actually forced into hand-to-hand combat, the Latin and Byzantine heavy cavalry almost always got the better of them. The result was a total rout. Kinemos says, "Many of them fell as they fled. Many were taken by the Roman soldiers, and the cavalry trampled many underfoot." John Kinemos tells us that when he heard of the disaster, the Sultan was pricked by the goads of regret, and he cursed himself for their untimely rashness. For sure, upon hearing the horrifying news of the defeat in the south, Kılıç Arslan knew that he really needed to make a deal now. As in, right now. No more lowballing, no more conniving, no more maneuvering. He needed to make peace with the emperor on any terms he could. So despite the war in the Western theater actually going pretty well, the Limping Lion wrote to the Emperor of the Romans and essentially totally capitulated. Basically, he offered Constantinople the whole 9 yards. Kılıç Arslan wrote to the emperor and proposed that not only would he return Roman hostages and captives, but he would cease raiding the empire, and crucially, he would stop any other Turkish group from doing likewise. If the emperor notified him of an incursion, the Sultan would take it upon himself to investigate the matter and punish the invaders. Remember, the Sultan's control over the wild tribes was always quite loose, something that Constantinople understood very well, even if the imperial authorities didn't really like it. Well, now, the Sultan was promising to deal with any of the wild tribes outside of his control when they inevitably crossed the Roman borders. He further promised to cede to the emperor a couple minor cities in the interior of western Anatolia as a little cherry on top. And in a shrewd bit of diplomacy, the Sultan promised that he would annually send an allied force of Turkish warriors on request. This was a truly valuable tool for the emperor, who was always looking for military muscle in his campaigns in the Balkans and the Levant. The fearsome horse archers. And it carried with it the corollary that the emperor would handsomely compensate the Sultan for annually sending this force. This offer was all that the emperor could ever hope for from a Turkish leader. Indeed, it went further than any deal ever reached previously with a Roman sultan. Not only would the sultan provide troops when requested and personally pledge not to raid the empire, but he even undertook an obligation to discipline the tribes for their raiding. Quite happy with this deal and getting worrying reports from the Balkans, Emperor Manuel immediately accepted it, turned his armies around, and marched back to Constantinople. The Limping Lion thus ended the war in the West at a great price. He had been forced to sacrifice a measure of the Sultanate's independence and had undertaken an obligation he honestly couldn't really fulfill. There was no way that he could seriously control the tribes in the way that he had promised the emperor. But importantly, he had also gained a lot here. Not only had he ended the war in the West and secured his western frontiers, but through offering aid to the emperor, he was sure to gain valuable imperial subsidies. And with his western frontier now completely safe, he was free to concentrate on his real enemies, the hated Yağbasan in Sivas, his brother and potential replacement in Ankara, Şahan Şah, and of course, the most formidable foe of them all, Nureddin Zengi, the Light of the Faith, the great rival of the Seljuks of Rum for the top of the totem pole in the Middle East. These men were his real enemies, the men who were plotting to have him killed. Above all, there was just no way that Kılıç Arslan and Yağbasan were ever going to patch things up. Their struggle had become a vicious and unrelenting blood feud, a war that would see one or the other dead. Neither side would ever truly be able to forgive the other or come to a permanent peace treaty. But that would have to be a task for another day. Even with his western flank secured, his army was just not in a position to continue the struggle with Yağbasan and Nureddin in the present. The Limping Lion had suffered a series of grievous losses. His treasury was likely empty, his armies depleted and demoralized. He needed to make a peace, in reality a truce, a temporary halt to the struggle. The terms were quickly agreed to. Through his sister, Nureddin's wife, Kılıç Arslan came to a deal with the Light of the Faith. He recognized Nureddin's new conquests in the south, and the two top Turkish rulers in the Middle East agreed to a peace. And, in what was an even harder concession to make, Kılıç Arslan reached out to Yağbasan, the man that he no doubt hated more than any other human being alive, and recognized his new conquests too, including confirming Nasreddin Mehmet as Bey of Malatya. We don't know what his deal with Şahan Şah was, but presumably he agreed that Şahan Şah would stay on in Ankara, and Şahan Şah agreed to not attack the Sultan. With these peace treaties in hand, the Sultan in Konya breathed a sigh of relief. The war, thankfully, was over. He had managed to survive an almost insurmountable combination of enemies attacking him from all sides, but at a great and heavy cost. But everyone knew that even if this was the end of the current war, it was not the end of the struggle. This was merely a rest, a breather. The bitterness and hatred between Kılıç Arslan and Yağbasan was not going anywhere. Their struggle would only end with one or the other dead. And similarly, the great rivalry between the Light of the Faith and the Second Sword Lion wasn't going anywhere either. Though this was less visceral, less existential than the struggle between Kılıç Arslan and Yağbasan, it was based on a fundamental geopolitical reality that was never going to go away. So long as a great power existed in Anatolia to his north, right next to the lands of the Levant, Nureddin was always going to be uneasy. Similarly, as long as the Light of the Faith kept racking up victories to his south, the Sultan in Konya would likewise always worry about him. Nureddin's legitimacy, and by now basically unlimited treasury, meant that he would be able to fund and back any alliance against the Sultan of Rum that might emerge in Anatolia. And the Sultan is going to have a lot more to worry about as the Zengid Emirate continues its conquest and definitively eclipses the Sultanate of Rum. Because, as we are going to shortly see, the light of the faith will come to succeed at a task that even the great Tuhrul had failed at. It will be the forces of Nureddin Zengi, led by a pair of, at the time, obscure Kurdish commanders, who will conquer Egypt and overthrow the Fatimid Imam Caliph, permanently ending the world's first Shia caliphate. Thus, in 1161, immediately after making a peace he knew to be temporary in the east, Kılıç Arslan turned his attention back to the west. Now was the time to truly seal his relationship with Byzantium, to fully secure his western borders, and thus prepare for the renewal of the struggle with Ya'abasan. And so, Kılıç Arslan began to make plans for something that no Roman sultan had ever done before. A grand state visit to Constantinople, to the new Rome itself. Here, he would cement an alliance with the emperor before returning east and again picking up his bow and arrows and firing arrows off in the direction of Sivas. Kılıç Arslan started by dispatching to Constantinople in late 1161 a man Michael the Syrian calls his Chancellor Christopher. This is an illuminating and fascinating tidbit. Chancellor, of course, is almost certainly Michael's rendering of vizier. Now, it's not surprising at all that Kılıç Arslan would have a vizier. As we have discussed, the state-building project undertaken by his predecessors, most importantly his father Mesud, had involved importing into the Sultanate the structures of government of the Perso-Islamic world more broadly. And we, of course, saw prior references to the Cadi and the other officers of the burgeoning civil and religious establishment running the Sultanate. But what is fascinating is that the man was named Christopher, meaning he was a Christian, or far more likely, a Christian convert to Islam. This is yet another indication of the way that the Sultanate inherited and incorporated the existing Byzantine elite and the existing Roman state structures into the Sultanate. Leading Byzantine families serving the Sultans of Rum, and, for those who wanted to get ahead politically, converting to Islam. Once in Constantinople, Christopher's first goal appears to have been to cut off any further negotiations between the emperor and the sultan's main rival in Anatolia, namely the hated Ya'abasan. As part of this, Christopher negotiated the terms of a visit of the sultan to the Queen of Cities, which were finally agreed to. This visit would, of course, involve what the Byzantines would see as the formal submission of the sultan. This would naturally be a great boon to the emperor, a way to demonstrate his great victories in the east and cement his authority within the Byzantine state. For his part, Kılıç Arslan would be expecting generous gifts typically given by the emperor to his supplicants, and a confirmation of an alliance that would allow him to focus his forces on his hated enemies to the east. With the groundwork thus laid, Kılıç Arslan departed Konya for Constantinople in spring 1162. Now, this is the first visit to Constantinople by a sultan recorded in the Byzantine sources, though likely Mesud had come to the city sometime in 1126, seeking aid against his brother Melik Arap. But certainly, this was the first time that a grand ceremonial meeting in the imperial city would take place between the emperor of the Romans and the Roman Sultan. and the Roman Sultan would be entering the city as a supplicant in Roman terms, very much the junior partner. John Kinemos says in wonder, "Of the very magnificent emperors, who is not outdone, that a man who rules so much land and lords it over so many tribes should appear at the emperor of the Romans' court in the guise of a servant." The emperor appears to have ridden out to meet the Sultan before the walls of the capital after the Sultan was ferried over to the European shore. From there, together, the two sovereigns entered the Queen of Cities, marching along the traditional route taken by Roman emperors during an imperial triumph. That is, through the Golden Gate of the Theodosian walls, near what is now Yedikule, and then down the Messe, the middle road of Byzantine Constantinople. In time, the Messe will become the Divan Yolu of Ottoman Constantinople, and remains today the great artery of the old city of Istanbul. Things were going grandly as the Sultan and the Emperor reached the heart of the city, what is now Sultanahmet in Istanbul. Here, the imperial party entered into the Grand Palace of Constantinople. This great palace stood where the Blue Mosque stands today. This large palace was the original Byzantine palace in Constantinople, bordering and joined to the great hippodrome, today the At Meydanı. In its magnificent audience chamber, a great throne had been set on a high dais, a throne made of gold and covered with uncountable numbers of sapphires, rubies, and pearls. Here the emperor sat, and John Kinemos says of his clothing, "A purple robe, a wonderful thing, enveloped him. From top to bottom, it was afire with rubies and illuminated with pearls, not indeed in disorder, but a marvelous artist's skills had embroidered it, since art depicted a genuine-looking meadow on the robe. From his neck to his chest, there hung on golden cords a jewel outstanding in size and color, ruddy as a rose, but in shape particularly like an apple. I deem it excessive to write about the adornment on his head." According to the Byzantine authors, Kılıç Arslan was thunderstruck by the wealth and the opulence of the great city, this grand palace, and above all, the raiment of the emperor. Indeed, this was a far, far cry from his comparatively extremely humble abode. We're not in Konya anymore. As the emperor of the Romans sat on his golden throne, a low wooden stool was brought to the side of the dais. Kılıç Arslan sat on this low stool next to the grand, golden imperial throne, and the ceremony, recognizing him as both a supplicant and as the rightful ruler in Konya, commenced. John Kinemos glosses over the details, but I assure you, this ritual obeisance to the emperor was not a comfortable moment for the Limping Lion. With the ceremony complete, the emperor and the sultan set out to present themselves to the people of the city in a public ritual that went all the way back to the Roman Republic on the banks of the Tiber in faraway Italy. But then a bad omen occurred. Choniates tells us that out of nowhere an earthquake struck the city and the skies darkened, adding ominously, God was wroth, and that under no circumstances would he tolerate an impious man to show himself and participate in a triumph, adorned by all hallowed furnishings and embellished by the likenesses of the saints and sanctified by the image of Christ. This incident is also recorded by John Kinemos, who saw it as a dark omen of the next meeting of the emperor and the sultan, a meeting that would take place far from the glittering world of Constantinople, in the mountains and the passes of Myriokephalon. But for now, the emperor and the sultan were determined to not let the bad omen of the earthquake mar what was an otherwise extremely successful event. Friendly relations between the Sultanate of Rum and the Roman Empire had been restored after what both sides assured each other was an unfortunate war and a series of mutual misunderstandings. The Sultan would stay as a guest of the emperor in Constantinople for 80 days, partaking in the delights of the Queen of Cities. Kinamos and Choniates share some anecdotes from Kılıç Arslan's trip to the city, including one rather interesting story that one of the Turkish visitors, who Kinamos says postured as a conjurer, intended to demonstrate a primitive sort of parachute or gliding device that he had invented. In front of the notables, he ascended a high point of the hippodrome and then jumped, but the device, naturally, failed to unfold as intended. In a classical illusion, John Kinamos says, "But he was an even more wretched sky runner than Icarus. Instead of taking wing, he plummeted groundward, like a solid mass pulled down by gravity." The poor man thus jumped to his death amid the raucous laughter of the onlooking crowd, incredulous that he had tried something so stupid. But the ill-fated Turkish Icarus aside, it seems that Kılıç Arslan and Manuel spent most of their time feasting, drinking, horse racing, hunting, watching massive spectacles in the hippodrome, almost certainly including jousting by Latin knights actually, and of course, deep in consultation. Naturally, this visit also included massive payments to the Sultan. Soon enough, the two sovereigns had cemented their relationship through a new deal. Of course, the terms previously agreed to were confirmed. Kinamos says that in particular, nor would he, that is Kılıç Arslan, allow those who lay beneath his authority, but who are clever at living by thefts and customarily are called Turkomans, to do any harm whatsoever to the Romans' land unpunished. This probably unenforceable promise to discipline the tribes was of course a huge win for the emperor. And as a side note, it is interesting that already the Byzantine authors are differentiating between the nomad Turkmen and the more settled urban Turks. Kinamos also says that Kılıç Arslan ceded further cities, though as he doesn't name them, we should probably discount that. He also says that Kılıç Arslan promised that he would not make a treaty with a foreign power without the emperor's approval. And if he did agree to this, this was certainly a completely hollow promise. But there was one hollow promise made by Kılıç Arslan that would prove to be a sticking point, one that would ultimately break the alliance in the years ahead and would lead to Myriokephalon. Lying through his teeth, Kılıç Arslan promised to return to the emperor certain cities that he might conquer in the future, including the Danishmend capital of Sivas. The Sultan, of course, had absolutely no intention of ever doing that. The alliance between Konya and Constantinople thus cemented, Kılıç Arslan returned home after 80 days of living it up in the imperial city to resume his war with Yağbasan. Choniates tells us that as he left the city, Kılıç Arslan had skimmed off many splendid gifts from the imperial treasuries, before which he stood amazed, wondering if the emperor could possibly possess others of such number and magnitude. He returned home, laden and rejoicing. Indeed, although the visit to Constantinople had involved the humiliating spectacle of the imperial audience and the formal submission to Byzantium, riding back east, the Limping Lion had a lot to be happy about. For one thing, he was returning home laden with gifts and treasures. And remember that in the Turkish tradition, going all the way back to the Turks' dealings with the Chinese emperors and the Persian shahs, gift-giving by an emperor was conceptualized as tribute. The Byzantines, however, in their own imperial tradition that went back to the Achaemenid Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, saw lavish gift-giving by the emperor as a mark of his sovereignty and power. So it may well be that both sides saw the rituals in somewhat different terms. And this would not be the end of the subsidies, because for merely sending a couple of contingents off to aid the emperor every year, a steady flow of treasure was assured to make its way east to Konya. At the cost of simply enduring a humiliating ceremony in a throne room in Constantinople and sending off a couple divisions of troops to the empire every year, Kılıç Arslan had extracted massive subsidies from the Roman Empire. Indeed, I would argue that Constantinople was far too focused on symbolic expressions of sovereignty. It bought them at an extremely high price from the Sultan. More importantly, this new relationship between Constantinople and Konya freed both the emperor and the Sultan to focus on other things. The emperor was able to turn his attention to the Balkans, Russia, and as we will discuss in a later episode, even a quixotic and of course ultimately doomed plan to invade Egypt. And for his part, Kılıç Arslan was able to now focus entirely on his existential struggle with Ya Abasan and the alliance against him in Anatolia supported by Nureddin. Indeed, all in all, I think that in material terms, it was Kılıç Arslan who actually benefited the most from this new alliance. And it turns out that Kılıç Arslan will use the peace humiliatingly bought in Constantinople far better than Emperor Manuel Komnenos. Because next time, the second Sword Lion is going to use the peace signed with the emperor, a stable western frontier, Byzantine absence from Anatolia, and massive subsidies from Constantinople to rip apart the Danishmend Beylik and basically reconquer Anatolia. And in the act of doing so, he is going to become far more powerful and far more dangerous than the emperor probably ever considered possible, as the Sultan feasted as his guest in the Queen of Cities. Meanwhile, the emperor will soon be sending armies off on a quixotic invasion of Egypt, as the armies of the Light of the Faith accomplish something not even achieved in the days of the Great Tughra. Egypt, the land of the Fatimid Caliphate, will finally fall, and it will be in Egypt that a certain young Kurdish commander will make a name for himself. A name that is today known throughout the whole world. Saladin.